So there are two different ways to report our GDP growth rate. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, also a very nice place to work, is the organization that provides quarterly reports on changes in U.S. gross domestic product. And they can provide the GDP growth rates either as an annualized rate or as a year-over-year rate. And they provide two different ways just to present the GDP growth rates, just to primarily confuse us, but they do give us two different ideas of how the U.S. economy is growing at any given moment in time. So with the annualized rate, the quarterly change in GDP is multiplied by 4, and it highlights seasonal fluctuations and growth. So the annualized rate is actually going to show us what happens if the United States were able to grow in this quarter for every single quarter within a particular calendar year. So we know that during wintertime, during the fourth quarter, there's Christmas in there. We typically see increases in consumption and increases in buying. So we typically see a tick up in our GDP growth rate because of this. So what happens if the United States were able to grow every single quarter, if every single quarter were like Christmas time? And that's what the annualized rate is going to be giving to us in this instance. However, what they report in terms of the annualized rate is not the actual GDP growth rate, because they multiply the actual growth rate by 4 in order to give us the annualized rate. So we do want to be a little bit careful about the interpretation with this annualized rate. So let's go ahead and give you a simple statement. So what the annualized rate? Annualized growth rate. And this is actually the most typical way that the BEA does report the GDP growth rates with the annualized rate. So suppose that the BEA, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, reports that the U.S. economy grew 0.7%. Grew 0.7% in the fourth quarter of 2020. And the fourth quarter of 2020. So what exactly does this mean for us in application? So this 0.7 that they report is exactly that. This is what they report. So this is what they give to us in the news stories, what they report, what we see. So this is the reported, as they call it. So we can say this is reported. The reported value that we see right here, the 0.7, is not the actual GDP growth rate, because they already multiplied this number by 4. So how do we figure out our actual GDP growth rate? So here we can take a look at the actual here. Actual. So the actual tells us, so interpretation, this means the GDP in the US, means the US GDP grew by, it's not 0.7%, it's 0.175%. So how do we get the 0.175%? We take what they report and we divide that by 4. So 0.7 divided by 4 in order to get the 0.175. And what does this mean? It tells us that the US GDP grew by 0.175% from the third quarter of 2020 to the fourth quarter of 2020, to the fourth quarter of 2020. So excuse this, let me get that out of the way, of 2020. So here you do notice that there are big differences between what they report and what is actually had with the data. So here it means the US GDP grew by 0.175% from the third quarter of 2020 to the fourth quarter of 2020. The US economy would grow 0.7% if this were seen every single quarter for the calendar year. So here, in order for us to get the actual, we need to divide the reported by 4 because there are 4 quarters within a year. If we wanted to get the reported, we need to go ahead and take the actual value and multiply it by 4. So just be aware of the similarities and differences here. The other way that we can report GDP is through the year-over-year rate. So a comparison of the GDP at the current quarter with the previous year, and it provides the trend in growth for the entire year. So the example that we worked with in the previous video, that is a year-over-year rate. So there's really no interpretation or calculations needed with the year-over-year rate. But for completion, we can go ahead and talk a little bit about it. So year-over-year rate. With the year-over-year rate, this says, give you a statement right here, the BEA reports the U.S. economy economy grew by 1.8%, from the fourth quarter of 2000, from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the same quarter in 2020, to the fourth quarter in 2020. So here, the BEA reports the U.S. economy grew by 1.8% from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the fourth quarter in 2020. There is no calculation needed with any of this. There's no sort of conversion needed. It exactly is as it says right here. So basically what we did in terms of the previous example, the year over year rate, they're essentially just using this formula right here. They go from the fourth quarter of 2019 to the fourth quarter of 2020. They have the data for all of this. They plug the numbers into this equation and out will pop that 1.8%. So essentially with this, with the year over year rate, it tells us exactly for 1 year how fast the U.S. economy, including all 4 quarters within the calendar year. So once again, 2 different ways for the BEA to talk about or to report our GDP growth rates. They do tend to fall back on the annualized rate just a little bit, but there is another way with the year over year rate, so you want to be careful with that.